My son ordered my coffee wrong at Thanksgiving. That's not the kind of sentence that sounds like the beginning of anything important. But it was. It was the beginning of the most frightening 3 weeks of my life, and the moment I understood that my son had been quietly, carefully asking me for help, the only way he knew I'd hear it. His name is Elliot. Wait, no. Elliot is on the list. Let me start again. His name is Finn. No, Finn's on there too. My son's name is Joel. That's what matters. Joel. He was 29 that Thanksgiving. Old enough that I didn't worry about him the way I used to when he was staying out past midnight in high school. Young enough that I still kept his childhood bedroom the same Navy comforter, the same bookshelf with the baseball trophies going dusty on the top row. I kept telling myself I'd redecorate. Never did. Joel had moved to Denver about 2 years before, taken a job with an engineering consultancy. He was doing well. Or I thought he was doing well. He sounded fine on the phone. A little distracted sometimes, but he was 29 and building a life. I didn't push. He drove up for Thanksgiving that year. Just the two of us. My wife passed 6 years ago, breast cancer, and Joel's an only child. It's quieter now. The holidays. We've learned to make it work. I smoke a turkey breast instead of a whole bird, and Joel always brings the good bourbon, and we watch football until one of us falls asleep on the couch. That's the picture. That's what Thanksgiving looks like in our house. He got in Wednesday evening, later than he said he would. I had chili on the stove. He walked in looking like a man who'd driven 8 hours and thought about problems the entire way. I asked if traffic was bad. He said yeah, it was pretty bad. He set his bag down and sat at the kitchen counter and looked at the chili like it had done something to him personally. I poured him a bowl anyway. He ate. We talked. Nothing unusual. Work, the drive, whether the Broncos had any shot this season. They didn't. Joel went to bed around 10. I almost didn't notice it until Thursday morning. I have a coffee routine. It's embarrassing how set I am in it, but I've been drinking the same coffee the same way for 30 years. 2 sugars, splash of whole milk. Not creamer, not half and half. Whole milk? My wife used to tease me about it, said I was the only person she'd ever met who had opinions about dairy fat in his coffee. Joel has watched me make that coffee 10,000 times. Thanksgiving morning I came downstairs and he'd already made a pot. Set a mug out for me. Poured it. 2 sugars already stirred in, but when I picked it up and took the first sip, there was no milk. Just black coffee with sugar. I looked at it. I looked at him. He was standing at the counter scrolling through his phone, not looking at me. Casual. Too casual. Now here's the thing. If this had happened any other year, I'd have just gone to the fridge and added the milk myself and thought nothing of it. But 2 months before that Thanksgiving, Joel and I had been sitting on my back porch during a summer visit, and I'd been half joking about how paranoid his mother used to be about emergency signals. She'd read something in a parenting magazine when he was about 12. Something about teaching kids a code word or action for dangerous situations. She'd set one up with Joel and laughed about it, said it was probably silly, but she liked knowing it was there. I'd forgotten about it for years. What I hadn't forgotten was that she told me, quietly, one evening before she got sick. She told me what it was. She said, if he ever makes your coffee wrong, pay attention. That's his way of telling you something's wrong that he can't say out loud. I'd thought it was sweet. A little theatrical, the kind of thing she would do. That morning, standing in my kitchen, I remembered every word of it. I didn't say anything right away. I added the milk. I sat down at the table. I watched my son scroll through his phone with the careful nonchalance of a man who was trying very hard to look like nothing was wrong. We made it through Thanksgiving. Turkey breast, bourbon, football. He laughed at the right times. He helped me with the dishes, but I watched him the way I used to watch him when he was a teenager, and something was going on. The way he'd get quiet at the wrong moments. The way he'd pull out his phone and then put it away without looking at it. After dinner I poured 2 glasses of the bourbon he brought, set one in front of him, said, "Talk to me." He looked up. I said, "I noticed the coffee this morning." He went very still. Then he put his hands flat on the table and let out a breath like he'd been holding it for 2 months. "I didn't know if you'd remember," he said. I told him I remembered everything his mother ever told me. He started talking. It had started about 4 months earlier, back in July. He'd met a man through a colleague at work, the kind of casual introduction that happens at a company happy hour, where someone says, You should meet so-and-so. I think you two would get along. The man's name was Harlan Briggs, late 40s, well-dressed, the kind of guy who knew enough about every topic to seem expert in all of them. He knew about the Broncos. He knew about engineering. He knew about Denver real estate. He knew, within 3 conversations, that Joel had inherited money when his mother passed. Joel hadn't told him directly. That was the thing that bothered me most when I heard it. He'd mentioned it sideways. Something about the house. Something about not having student loans anymore. Nothing that should have flagged anything, but Harlan Briggs was paying attention in a way that Joel hadn't recognized as dangerous. By August, they were having lunch every couple of weeks. Harlan talked a lot about investing. He had a way of making it sound inevitable, like only people who were afraid or uninformed kept their money sitting in index funds. He talked about a private equity vehicle. He said he'd gotten several colleagues into it, that the returns were extraordinary, that it wasn't something you could find through a normal broker because it wasn't marketed to retail investors. Exclusive, access only, the kind of opportunity that didn't come twice. He called it the Crestfield Group. Joel was interested. Joel was 29 and had money he'd inherited, and wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. And here was this confident, knowledgeable man telling him he had a rare chance to do something smart with it. I understand why it was appealing. I'm not angry at my son for being appealing to. In September, Harlan sent him documents, a prospectus, or something that looked like one, an investment agreement, a wire transfer form. Joel told me he almost signed. He was 90% of the way to signing. What stopped him was a name. He'd been reading through the paperwork more carefully the night before he was going to send the wire, and he noticed that the signatory on the investment agreement, the person listed as fund manager, wasn't Harlan Briggs. It was someone named Aldous Crestfield. That wasn't unusual in itself, but when Joel searched for Aldous Crestfield, he found almost nothing. A LinkedIn profile that was sparse and recent. A single mention in a press release for a company that no longer had a working website. He searched for the Crestfield Group. The regulatory filings that should have existed for a private equity fund didn't exist. No SEC registration. No state-level registration in Colorado. Nothing. He called Harlan and asked about it. Harlan had an answer ready. Said the fund operated under an exemption, that most sophisticated vehicles did, that Joel could call his own attorney if he wanted to verify, but that this kind of skepticism was exactly what kept regular people from building real wealth. He said it warmly, almost kindly, which was somehow worse than if he'd been defensive. Joel didn't send the wire, but he also didn't cut contact. Because Harlan kept calling, kept texting, started asking whether Joel had talked to his father about this, had mentioned that family wealth was often a source of additional capital for these kinds of opportunities, started pushing on a timeline, said the window was closing in December, said there were only a few spots left, and he'd held one for Joel, specifically because he believed in him. Joel said it felt like standing at the edge of something, and not being able to see how far the drop was. He'd wanted to call me. He said he'd picked up the phone 4 or 5 times. But every time he thought about what to say, he couldn't figure out how to start. He was embarrassed. He felt like he'd been naive and he didn't want me to think less of him. He was afraid I'd tell him he'd been foolish for getting this far into it. And he was also, and this is the part that broke my heart a little, he was also still not entirely sure he was right. Harlan was so convincing. What if Joel called me and I told him he was overreacting and he passed on something real? What if his instincts were wrong? So instead, on Thanksgiving morning, he made my coffee without the milk. I sat with all of that for a moment. The kitchen was quiet. Outside the window, the backyard was brown and gray. A few dead leaves stuck to the fence. I asked him to show me everything. He went to his room and came back with his laptop. I read the documents. I looked at the prospectus. It was professional looking. Better than I expected, actually. Good formatting. Real-sounding language. The kind of thing that would have fooled me if I hadn't known to be suspicious. The investment agreement had a physical address in Phoenix for the Crestfield Group. I wrote it down. I told Joel to forward me all of the emails from Harlan Briggs. He sent me 41 of them. I spent that night reading. By midnight, I had a clear enough picture. The Crestfield Group's listed address was a mail forwarding service, the kind that rents virtual office space. The fund manager's name, Aldous Crestfield, appeared to be fabricated, or, at minimum, a pseudonym, because no person by that name had any professional history before 2021. Harlan Briggs himself had a thin digital footprint, and a LinkedIn that had been created about 14 months prior. The next morning, while Joel slept in, I called a man named Rupert Owens. Rupert and I went to college together. He spent 30 years as a securities attorney, and he owes me several favors I've never collected on. I called in one. I read in the name of the fund, the structure, the registration status. I read in the signatory name and the Phoenix address. He was quiet for about 4 seconds. Then he said, "This is a 56B exemption fraud. The whole thing is manufactured. Don't let your son send $1. I already knew that. But hearing it from Rupert made it real in a way I needed it to be real. Rupert also told me something I hadn't thought about. He said the more important question wasn't whether the fund was fraudulent. It clearly was. The more important question was whether Harlan Briggs was an independent operator or part of a larger network. He said these kinds of schemes often had multiple recruiters working in parallel, each targeting someone with a liquidity event, an inheritance, a settlement, a real estate sale. He said if Joel cut contact without documenting anything, the recruiter would just move on. He said if Joel was willing, and if we were careful, there was a way to document it that might actually be useful to the people who handled these things. I went upstairs and knocked on Joel's door. He was awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, already dressed, looking like he hadn't slept much. He looked like he was 12 years old and waiting to hear how much trouble he was in. I sat down in the desk chair and told him what Rupert said. Then I told him what I was going to ask of him and that he could absolutely say no. The idea was simple. Joel would re-engage with Harlan, tell him he'd decided to go forward, that he wanted to move quickly before the December window closed, but that he needed to talk through the wire instructions one more time by phone. Joel would record the call. In the conversation, he would ask specific questions, the name of the fund manager, the regulatory status, the physical location of the fund, the fee structure, the specific returns. He would let Harlan fill in all the blanks himself. Joel was quiet for a long time. He said, "What if he gets suspicious?" I said that was possible, but that Harlan had 41 emails invested in this. He'd spend 4 months grooming Joel. He wasn't going to walk away because of one careful phone call. Joel said, "And then what? We just have a recording." I said the recording would go to Rupert, and Rupert would know where it needed to go from there. Joel nodded slowly, looked out the window at the dead backyard. He said, "He asked about you, Dad. Last month, he asked if my father might be interested in the same opportunity. He said something about multi-generational investing." I held that for a second. Then I told him we were definitely making the call. We did it the Sunday after Thanksgiving. Joel called from my kitchen. I sat across the table where he could see me. He had his phone recording on a second device. He was good. Better than I expected. He was calm. He asked the questions like they were the questions of an eager investor who just wanted to understand, and Harlan answered all of them. Every detail. The fund structure, the claimed returns, the wire destination, the timeline, all this Crestfield's role and background. He described Crestfield as a former institutional fund manager who'd moved to private markets after 20 years at a major bank. At the end of the call, Harlan said, "I knew you'd come around. I knew you were the right kind of person for this." Joel said he'd be in touch about the wire. He hung up. He put the phone down on the table. We looked at each other. He said, "I feel sick." I said I felt it too. I sent the recording to Rupert that night. Rupert forwarded it along with the documents to a contact at the SEC's Denver regional office and to the Colorado Division of Securities. He told me these things moved slowly, that I shouldn't expect a quick resolution, that the people in that office were busy and underfunded and doing their best with too many cases. But he also said the recording was clean and specific and the kind of thing that actually helped. Joel blocked Harlan Briggs on every platform the following morning. When the December window came and went without a wire, Harlan sent 3 emails to an address Joel no longer checked and then went silent. We don't know what happened to Harlan Briggs after that. Rupert told me, months later, that the Crestfield Group name had come up in connection with a broader investigation, that several other investors had been contacted using the same pitch. I don't know how many of them got out. I hope most of them. What I know is my son drove back to Denver in December with his money intact and his dignity intact and a story he hadn't wanted to tell anyone but me. He called me on Christmas Eve, just to talk, the way we do. At the end of the call, before we hung up, he said, "I've been thinking about Mom lately." I said I had too. He said, "She was smart, setting that up." I didn't think I'd ever actually use it. I told him she had good instincts about people, about what they need when she wasn't around to give it to them. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She knew you'd remember." I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say. Here's what I want you to take from this, if you're listening. The person trying to take your money, or your son's money, or your sister's money, or your neighbor's, they are not going to look like what you think they look like. They are going to be someone who makes you feel seen, someone who laughs at the right things, asks the right questions, remembers small details. That's not friendliness. That's reconnaissance. And if someone in your life suddenly starts acting a little strange, a little off, a little too quiet, forgetful in ways they don't normally forget, ask them directly. Don't assume it's nothing. Don't assume they'll come to you when they're ready. Sometimes the people we love are waiting for us to notice. Sometimes it's just a cup of coffee, made wrong on purpose. Pay attention. I've thought about this a lot in the months since, about what actually happened and why it went the way it did. And the honest answer is that nothing about this story was luck. Every piece of it traced back to a choice someone made. Harlan, Joel, my wife, me, and every one of those choices had a consequence that was completely consistent with the kind of person who made it. Harlan spent 4 months being patient, attentive, strategic. He studied my son the way a contractor studies a structure. Before he figures out where to put pressure, he was good at it. But that same calculation, that same cold, methodical approach to other people, is exactly what left him without a single real relationship to protect him when things unraveled. He built his whole operation on the assumption that people are isolated and too embarrassed to ask for help. That assumption cost him. Joel did something that took real courage, and I don't think he'd call it that. He'd say he just made the coffee wrong. But what he actually did was admit, without words, because he couldn't find the words yet, that he'd gotten in over his head and needed someone he trusted. That's not a small thing. A lot of people can't do that at 45. He did it at 29, and the only reason he could was because he'd spent his whole life watching his mother and me be honest with each other about hard things. You learn that. It's not something you're born with. And my wife, she's been gone 6 years, and she still protected her son. She thought ahead to a version of the future she wouldn't be in, and she built something into it for him anyway. That's what intelligence in service of love looks like. Not grand gestures. A small, private system. A cup of coffee made wrong on purpose. She trusted me to remember it, and she trusted Joel to use it, and we both did. I don't take that lightly. What I keep coming back to is this. The people who prey on others almost always count on silence. They count on embarrassment. They count on the gap between what we're going through and what we're willing to say out loud to the people who matter. That gap is where they live. Close it, and they have almost nothing to work with. If you take one thing from Joel's story, I'd want it to be that, not just watch out for investment scams, though yes, watch out for investment scams. But more than that, keep the lines open with the people you love. Make it normal in your family to say something feels off and I don't know what to do. Make it safe to be uncertain. Make it safe to have almost made a mistake. Because Joel almost made one. He got close enough to the edge to feel it, and the only reason he's okay is that he knew, somewhere under all that embarrassment and confusion, that I was someone he could signal, that I'd be paying attention, that I'd remember. Be that person for someone, and make sure they know it.